the sea was calm, its surface kissed by the silver hush of early morning light. Far out beyond the curve of the horizon, the slow breathing of the ocean swelled and eased, stretching endlessly in every direction like a gentle cradle of water and wind. Somewhere in the quiet miles between continents, vast ships sat heavy on the tide, their sails stirring faintly in the breeze, their hulls creaking like old timbers in the silence of waiting. It was a morning like any other in the age of sails, an age when the wind decided everything and wooden ships bore the weight of empires. The year was 1805, and all across Europe, the air felt thick with expectancy. The long wars between Britain and Napoleonic France had twisted across the land like smoke from a distant fire, curling through politics, shifting borders, and uneasy alliances. But at sea, something deeper moved, a slow, inevitable drift toward confrontation. Quietly, ships were being readied. Crews were drilled, provisions loaded, powder kegs stacked below. Letters were written home. Some sent their final goodbyes before knowing they'd ever left. In the harbors of Cádiz, in the coves of the Channel, and across the rough-hewn decks of Britain's coastal forts, a breath was being held. Tonight, we'll drift gently into this turning point of naval history, into the soft rise and fall of the waves that carried the great fleets of Britain, France, and Spain, and into the quiet hours just before sails were trimmed and the guns were run out. Together, we'll explore the world of the Battle of Trafalgar, the wood and canvas, the ocean and sky, the people who sailed into the unknown, and the echoes that linger long after their ships slipped below the horizon. Welcome to Sleepy Journeys, the podcast designed to lull you into a peaceful slumber with soothing stories through time, places, and ideas. Whether you're winding down after a long day or simply looking for a peaceful escape, you're in the right place. My name's Jack, and I'm so happy to have you here with me. Each night on Sleepy Journeys, we set off together on gentle adventures designed to soothe your mind and ease you into rest. You'll find journeys through history, comforting fairy tales, myths and folklore, the wonders of science, fascinating inventions, inspiring famous figures, music history, and even calm explorations around the world. No matter where your curiosity takes you, there's a dreamy, Sleepy Journeys show for you. Tonight, we're going to embark on a gentle journey through the fall of the Franco-Spanish fleet at Trafalgar. And just before we fully drift off, if you're enjoying Sleepy Journeys, go ahead and tap follow or subscribe on whatever platform you're joining me on. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming sleepy adventures. And let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. Out in the Atlantic, there's a kind of stillness that carries its own sound. The hush of distant wind slipping past the mast, the lapping of sea against the hull, the occasional call of a gull circling high above a fleet anchored and waiting. In those moments, just before the tide changes, time seems to slow. Sailors pace the decks in quiet routine. Officers consult charts and whisper to each other near the helm. And far away, beyond any spyglass, the weather holds its breath. In that fragile stillness, we'll explore not only the battle that unfolded, but the shape of the world that brought it to sea. We'll step softly onto the decks of HMS Victory, feel the roll of the tide beneath our feet, and listen as the sails strain gently against the breeze. We'll visit the thoughts of those preparing for battle, the strategies that formed under starlit skies, and the quiet grace with which history moved across the water. Now, let your eyes grow heavy and your breath grow slow. There is nothing to do here but listen. The journey is soft and long, and the sea is always patient. The decks of a warship at anchor were a world of quiet rhythms, especially in the early hours of the morning. Before the orders of the day rose with the sun, there was a gentle hush that settled across the timbers, like the ship itself was in a state of deep rest. Above, the sails hung loosely, catching only the faintest whispers of breeze. Ropes creaked softly where they were tied off, swaying ever so slightly in time with the ship's slow rocking. The sound of water lapping against the hull played like a quiet percussion, regular and subdued. Below deck, the steady breath of sleeping men rose and fell in near unison, layered over the subtle groans of the ship's frame shifting gently with the sea. Hammocks, strung neatly in rows between the beams, swayed just slightly, each one a small cocoon of rest after the labor of the previous day. The scent of salt air mingled with wood, tallow, and worn canvas. Occasionally, a booted step would pass overhead as one of the watch made his round, his path familiar, his pace unhurried. There was time enough for the duties that lay ahead, but for now, quiet endured. Out on the quarterdeck, a lone officer might be found standing still, watching the stars fade slowly as the edge of dawn brightened the eastern sky. He might clutch a logbook beneath one arm, or rest his gloved hands on the railing, eyes scanning the horizon. These were the peaceful hours where the great responsibilities of command could drift for just a little while, replaced by the soft pull of memory or hope. In the quiet before morning, even admirals could be men again. Sons, fathers, lovers, thinking of homes far from sea. Near the galley, a few sailors stirred early, stoking embers into small flames, preparing kettles and cups. A mug of weak tea passed hand to hand in silence, steam curling upward into the cool air. No one spoke much at that hour. Words could wait. All around them, the ship was alive but resting, like a creature in slumber, sensing that movement would soon begin again. The canvas above barely rustled. The ropes, carefully coiled and tied, glistened faintly with dew. Lanterns swung gently from hooks, their light low and golden, flickering across the polished wood. Even the crows nesting in the rigging remained silent for now, swaying gently with the mast. Time aboard such ships had a rhythm of its own, especially in the days before action. Each crew member followed an internal compass, when to polish, when to drill, when to sleep. But the moments before all that, the very first moments of walkie, those were the stillest of all. The ship breathed as a whole. And in that breath, something ancient could be felt. The great stillness before a shift, the quiet before the wind changes. Across the continent, far from the wooden decks and salt air, Europe moved in slow, careful steps. In drawing rooms and palace corridors, In candlelit chambers and echoing war rooms, there was a sense that the world was quietly leaning towards something. The early 19th century was a time of restless peace and quiet conflict, an uneasy balance where empires breathed deeply and watched each other through the smoke of diplomacy. Britain, surrounded by sea and defined by it, had long understood the language of ships. Her fleets had become her shield and voice, and in these uncertain years, they were being prepared with quiet determination. In Portsmouth and Chatham, in the dockyards along the River Medway and the Solent, men hammered, stitched, and hauled, rebuilding, provisioning, and launching ship after ship. Carpenters shaped great ribs of oak. Riggers spun miles of rope. Blacksmiths fed their fires through foggy dawns. Each tool, each plank, was part of something larger and unceasing. Naval officers, hardened by years at sea, returned again and again to their charts. They traced currents and winds with slow fingers, noting where enemy fleets had been spotted, where weather patterns might shift, where coastal batteries could offer shelter or peril. Communications came in folded parchment, sealed in wax, and carried by swift cutters across rough waters. There was a rhythm to it all, a quiet pulse beneath the greater noise of war. France, under the towering presence of Napoleon Bonaparte, was turning its gaze toward the sea. Though his empire had been built largely on land, the ocean remained both a challenge and an opportunity. The French Navy, battered in earlier years, was being reinforced with new vessels and strengthened leadership. But its confidence lay in alliance. Spain, sharing both water and wariness with France, found herself drawn into a reluctant partnership. Bound by complex treaties and diplomatic needs, her fleet merged into the Franco-Spanish Armada. Together, they became a force of formidable size, anchored in Cádiz, watched closely by the British blockade, and waiting for the right wind, the right moment, the right signal to move. Yet beneath the banners and proclamations, there was uncertainty. The alliance between France and Spain was uneasy, a joining of needs more than of trust. Officers sometimes disagreed in quiet council. Orders passed through translations, customs clashed. But still, the fleets assembled, row by row, their sails furled and guns silent, preparing for what might come. The world waited as if holding its breath. Farmers sowed fields in the countryside, unaware of the messages being dispatched between admirals. Merchants carried on across busy ports, moving goods between crates as men in uniform passed them by. In cities like London, Paris, and Madrid, newspapers speculated in cautious tones, offering rumors and reassurance in equal measure. It was a tension felt as quiet anticipation, like distant thunder over a still field. The kind of stillness that precedes a shift in the wind, where the leaves tremble softly and the air carries a scent of change. In the calm harbors of Britain, where stone quays met the shifting tide, the Royal Navy stood watchful and ever-present. Its ships, shaped from centuries of tradition, were more than machines of war. They were living vessels, bearing the weight of a nation's hopes and the quiet pride of its island spirit. In 1805, the British fleet was no longer simply a tool of empire. It was its guardian, its emissary, and its patient sentinel. The Royal Navy had grown both in size and confidence. After generations at sea, it had learned to listen to the wind, to read the sea, and to know the language of distant sails on the horizon. Its structure was organized with calm precision, from the quiet dignity of flagships to the swift cutters that danced between them. Ships of the line, vast three-masted giants like the HMS Victory, formed the backbone of the fleet. They carried dozens of guns and hundreds of men, and they sailed with a steady, unflinching grace. Each ship bore its own crew, tightly knit like the weave of a well-used sail. Captains and lieutenants moved through their routines with quiet discipline, giving and receiving orders in voices low and firm. Midshipmen, some scarcely past their school years, watched and learned, their eyes wide beneath worn hats. And the seamen, each with calloused hands and sun-marked skin, performed their duties with the patience of long habit. Everyone knew their place, their rhythm, their task. Admiral Horatio Nelson stood at the center of this quiet power. He was a man of unusual presence. Small in stature, calm in voice, he moved with the easy grace of someone who belonged entirely to the sea. His leadership had earned loyalty through trust. His sailors often called him our Nelson, a phrase spoken with quiet affection. Nelson understood more than strategy. He understood people. He walked the decks, spoke to the men, and listened. He kept watch from the same rails as his lieutenants, shared jokes with the young officers, and considered carefully the quiet questions brought to him by worried captains. There was a softness to his resolve, no less firm, but deeply human. He believed in his crew. He believed in the fleet. The ships themselves were maintained with care, bordering on reverence. Below decks, powder rooms were kept dry and secure. Cannon were polished until they shone in the lantern light. Sails were patched with quiet skill. Every morning, decks were scrubbed and rigging checked. This daily rhythm, quiet, constant, careful, was what made the fleet ready. At sea, each British ship moved as part of a great, silent choreography. Signals passed from mast to mast like whispers across the sky. Telescopes rose and lowered. Orders were acknowledged with brief nods. No sound was wasted. No motion without meaning. The fleet, under Nelson's guidance, became a single, fluid presence upon the sea. As October approached, the British Royal Navy waited just beyond sight of Cádiz, their sails drawn tight, their guns at rest. They waited with the calm of those who knew the sea would speak in its own time. And when it did, they would be ready. In the sheltered waters off the southern coast of Spain, the Franco-Spanish fleet rested at anchor, its many masts rising like a forest of slender trunks against the sky. From the harbor of Cádiz, where old stone walls met the salt-streaked air, the combined fleet formed a great assembly of wood and sail, stretching gently across the quiet tide. More than 30 ships of the line, French and Spanish alike, lay side by side, held together not only by anchor cables, but by an uneasy partnership shaped by necessity. The Spanish vessels were built with time-honored craftsmanship, sturdy, broad-hulled, and richly adorned. Ships such as Príncipe de Asturias and Santa Ana carried proud names, long histories, and officers steeped in maritime tradition. Spanish sailors moved across their decks with practiced familiarity. Many had spent decades at sea, and their voices carried the slow cadence of old knowledge. The Spanish admiral, Federico Gravina, was a thoughtful man, respected for his composure and caution. His command was marked by deliberate planning and a quiet sense of duty. The French ships, meanwhile, were sleek and agile, newer in design, with sharp lines and ambitious commanders. Their flagship, Bucentaure, was the pride of the fleet, elegant, swift, and heavily armed. Vice Admiral Pierre-Charles Villeneuve, who commanded the French forces and the fleet as a whole, bore the weight of great responsibility, his decisions scrutinized by distant eyes in Paris. He was a man of intellect and conviction, yet the burden of alliance, strategy, and expectation pressed on him heavily, even in moments of calm. Together, these two navies formed a force impressive in scale, but gently fractured in spirit. Language barriers, differing naval traditions, and contrasting leadership styles moved beneath the surface like slow undercurrents. Though outwardly aligned, the French and Spanish captains often operated on different assumptions about readiness, tactics, and even timing. Orders sometimes passed slowly through the ranks. Responses were cautious. Meetings between senior officers took place in quiet corners of decks and lantern-lit cabins, words chosen carefully, faces unreadable. Yet the fleet itself remained poised. Sailors scrubbed decks and checked supplies. Gunners tested their cannon recoil with silent precision. Carpenters replaced worn boards and tightened loose joints. Priests aboard Spanish ships offered morning prayers under canvas awnings. On the French vessels, officers marked maps and polished their brass telescopes. The routines of readiness continued, steady and calm. From the shore, local fishermen watched the great ships sway in the harbor, their hulls looming above the waterline like sleeping giants. Children in the streets of Cádiz played at naval games with carved wooden boats, unaware of the tension that drifted just offshore. To the townspeople, the presence of the fleet had become a kind of backdrop, constant, quiet, part of the sea itself. There was little open conflict between the allies. Instead, there was a deep, still uncertainty, an unspoken question that passed silently from ship to ship. When would they move, and would they move as one? In the evenings, as the sun dipped low and bathed the rigging in gold, a hush settled across the fleet. Lanterns flickered to life. Mess kettles rattled gently below deck. Officers stood at their rails, staring into the horizon where the British blockade hovered, just out of sight. The water between them was still, but the space was filled with unvoiced decisions, slow brewing intentions, and the faint creak of ships waiting to sail. The harbor of Cádiz stirred before the sun rose. Pale light touched the rooftops and stone piers as gulls wheeled above the gently rocking masts. Below, the tide pressed softly against the keels of anchored ships, brushing barnacles and ballast alike. On the decks of the Franco-Spanish fleet, there was a hush of activity, deliberate and calm. A movement had begun, and though it was measured, its direction was clear. For weeks, the Allied ships had rested in quiet anticipation. Their hulls had weathered soft rains and long sunlit days. Crews had trained and drilled, eaten and prayed, tended sails and checked provisions. Messages had moved in and out of the Admiralty like tides of ink and paper. And now the signal had arrived. The time had come to set out, slowly, steadily, into the open Atlantic. One by one, sails were unfurled. Great sheets of canvas bloomed like clouds catching the morning wind. Lines were drawn taut and anchors lifted with care. Chain links rose dripping from the sea, their cold metal glinting in the growing light. On every vessel, men moved with quiet coordination. The ships turned westward, moving in a long, curving line, their sails catching the same breath of breeze. It was October 19th, and the sea beyond Cádiz shimmered with possibility. The weather was fair, and the winds light, just enough to carry the fleet gently forward. The Franco-Spanish ships slipped out of harbor like sleepwalkers, slow and composed, their wakes spreading faintly behind them. Masts swayed gently in rhythm. Flags rustled in the upper rigging. Officers watched the horizon, telescopes in hand, marking the outlines of each vessel as it took its place in the line. Aboard the Bucentaure, Vice Admiral Villeneuve stood quietly at the quarterdeck, coat buttoned against the salt wind, eyes fixed ahead. His decision to leave the safety of Cádiz had not come easily. The weight of delay, of indecision, had hung over him like mist. But now, the movement had begun, and there was no turning back without cause. He hoped the coordination would hold, that the unity of this complex fleet would endure the swell and strain of open sea. To the north, out beyond the curve of the coast, the British blockade watched in silence. Their sails, often invisible from Cádiz, were now slowly converging as signals passed calmly from ship to ship. The Royal Navy had anticipated such a departure. Their lines shifted, adjusted, but did not hurry. Their time would come. Through the afternoon and into the evening, the Franco-Spanish fleet continued its slow progress. The sea remained kind, its surface rippling in the light of a cloud-dappled sky. Dolphins swam in the distance. The hum of sails filled the air. Below deck, sailors prepared for another night at sea, rations portioned, lamps lit, hammocks hung. Conversation remained hushed. Everyone understood the significance of this movement, though few said it aloud. As night fell, stars appeared in the clean black sky, their light mirrored in the dark water. The ships continued westward, their silhouettes soft and silent against the night. Far behind them, Cádiz faded into the distance, its lanterns flickering faintly on the coast. Somewhere ahead, beyond the edge of the visible sea, a meeting waited. But for now, the journey had only just begun, slow, careful, and carried on the breath of wind. Aboard HMS Victory, the flagship of the British fleet, the evening light cast long, amber shadows across the weathered deck. The soft rhythm of waves tapped gently along the hull, while high above, the sails hung in folded rest, waiting for the morning wind. Admiral Horatio Nelson stood beside the quarter-deck rail, his gaze turned toward the horizon where nothing yet stirred, but everything was about to change. Nelson's thoughts moved slowly, like ships tracing long arcs across a chart. He was not a man drawn to noise or spectacle, but to clarity, the kind that emerges only after hours of quiet observation. Over the long months of blockade and preparation, he had come to see not only the strengths of his own fleet, but the subtle hesitations in the Allied armada. In their scale, in their divided leadership, in the very size of their formation, Nelson saw an opportunity for control. The strategy he imagined was simple, but quietly daring. Traditional naval battles of the era followed careful choreography. Two fleets lined up parallel to one another, exchanging broadsides in a long, echoing duel. Nelson's plan was to break from that tradition, to divide the line. He envisioned his fleet sailing directly at the enemy, splitting their formation in two and isolating its rear from its van. In doing so, the British ships could surround smaller groups of opponents, concentrate their fire, and bring the battle to a close before it truly began. The maneuver was known in principle, but seldom used. It required trust between ships, between captains, and most of all, in the quiet precision of timing. Each vessel had to move with confidence, even under fire. They had to follow without signals, without pause. It was a strategy born from familiarity, not force. Nelson had prepared his captains with letters and personal conversations, explaining the essence of the plan in quiet encouragement. He believed in their judgment. He trusted their instincts. "No captain," he had written, "can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of an enemy." It was a phrase passed along with calm conviction, whispered from one deck to the next. In the hours before the battle, there was a kind of steady readiness, a shared understanding among the ships that they were part of something carefully shaped. Victory, Temeraire, Royal Sovereign, and the others, each would have a role to play. Each would move according to a slow and deliberate dance. Nelson's strategy was more than a tactic. It was a philosophy. He believed that precision, unity, and calm under pressure were mightier than sheer force. The battle ahead was to be guided by a deep, steady current of resolve. As the stars wheeled slowly overhead and the sea rocked gently beneath his feet, Nelson lingered at the rail a while longer. He could hear the murmur of the crew below, the occasional clang of a lantern against its hook, the distant ripple of waves across the fleet. In these quiet sounds, he found the rhythm of the coming day. The plan was set. The night was calm. And in the hush before dawn, the British fleet drifted in silence, like a deep breath held just before it is released. The morning of October 21st arrived without fanfare. A pale golden light slowly crept across the Atlantic horizon, softening the edge of the world with its quiet glow. The sky, brushed in subtle hues of lavender and peach, opened gradually above the two fleets, revealing high, feathered clouds drifting like silk. The sea was nearly still, stirred only by the gentle breath of dawn wind, carrying the scent of salt and distant shorelines. Aboard every ship in both fleets, men rose from their hammocks and set about their duties in silence. The steady rhythm of habit, the same motions repeated as they had been countless times before. Boots scraped lightly on the wooden planks. Buckles were fastened. Water was poured over faces and hands. Some muttered quiet prayers beneath their breath, while others folded small letters into worn leather satchels, their words meant for distant hearths and waiting families. On HMS Victory, the air held a thoughtful stillness. Admiral Nelson, dressed in his full uniform, moved across the deck with a slow, purposeful stride. He spoke to his officers with warmth, his words measured and calm, eyes steady beneath the brim of his hat. He greeted each man as if this day were no different from the one before, offering small nods and gentle acknowledgments. To some, he gave messages to be passed along. To others, simple, sincere thanks. Before the sails were trimmed, before the lines were cast, Nelson retired to his cabin for a final quiet moment. He wrote a short letter. Its tone was peaceful, almost contemplative, as though he knew the sea would soon carry him towards something vast and final. On the desk beside him, a miniature portrait of Lady Emma Hamilton stood in its small brass frame. He looked at it for a long moment, then placed it gently into a drawer. Above deck, the first signal flags began to rise. They fluttered in the light breeze, catching the sun like colored ribbons in the sky. Crews aboard the British ships paused to watch them unfurl. The message they carried was simple but enduring. England expects that every man will do his duty. The words passed silently across the fleet, met with nods, quiet acknowledgments, and the calm resumption of tasks already in motion. On the Franco-Spanish side, the morning unfolded in kind. The Allied ships, though facing tension within, were nonetheless stately and composed. Men readied the gun decks, hauling powder and shot into place with well-practiced movements. Officers gathered near their charts, observing the wind and the changing positions of the enemy ships, now slowly advancing from the northwest. From Bucentaure, Admiral Villeneuve watched the British formation with a thoughtful stillness. He understood their intention now. It was unmistakable. The British would sail directly toward the line, and in doing so, would force chaos into the order of engagement. But the die had been cast. There was no turning back across calm waters. Above all the sound and preparation, a deep quiet persisted. Acceptance, perhaps. The kind that comes when a long-anticipated moment finally unfolds. Birds circled lazily in the sky. The sails filled slowly with wind. Across both fleets, men completed their morning rituals, tied letters to messages, adjusted coats, and stood ready. As the morning deepened and the lights settled fully upon the sea, the British fleet continued its quiet approach. The wind, light but steady, caught the sails and guided each vessel forward with patient resolve. Across the gentle rise and fall of the Atlantic swells, the ships advanced in two columns, each line of hulls gliding through the water like graceful shadows upon a silver-blue canvas. The first moments of the Battle of Trafalgar unfolded with a steady, deliberate rhythm, like the opening notes of a solemn orchestral piece. Nelson's line, led by HMS Victory and HMS Royal Sovereign, moved directly toward the Allied formation, cutting across the expected course. The Franco-Spanish line remained in place, stretching long and wide, its ships poised side by side, like a great wooden barrier drawn across the sea. As the distance between fleets narrowed, sails were adjusted with quiet precision. Gun crews stood ready at their posts, the ropes of the great cannons coiled neatly beside them, powder charges stacked nearby. Orders passed in low tones. Officers paced slowly, hands behind backs, eyes focused forward. The deck was a place of calm action, every motion measured, every breath steady. The first shots came in a series of deep, distant echoes. From the lead French ship, a cannon fired across the water, its smoke blooming in a soft gray cloud that drifted lazily with the breeze. A reply followed soon after, and then another. There was space between the reports, time enough to hear the wind between them. The opening salvos marked the beginning, a quiet tipping of the balance between silence and sound. As Victory pressed ahead, her bow pointed toward the line between Redoutable and Bucentaure. Her crew moved with calm certainty. Cannonballs struck the sides of her hull, thudding heavily into the thick oak, sending splinters into the air. Still, she moved forward, cutting through the line exactly as Nelson had intended. On the quarterdeck, he stood serene, watching the formations shift around him, as if the ships themselves were instruments in a vast and careful design. Elsewhere in the fleet, similar moments unfolded. HMS Royal Sovereign, under Admiral Collingwood, broke through the line near Santa Ana, her guns already replying with slow, rhythmic fire. The ships around her swayed slightly with the force of their broadside, the smoke curling upward and outward in soft, twisting layers. The sea itself remained gentle beneath the battle, as if undisturbed by the motion above. Waves lapped against the hulls. Debris floated slowly across the surface, fragments of rope, a fallen spar, the drifting corner of a torn sail. Every now and then, a gull would cry out, its call oddly clear between cannon shots. The British ships, as they moved into position, followed Nelson's plan with elegant simplicity. By breaking the enemy's line, they created smaller clusters of conflict, manageable, focused, and each attended with care. Each ship found its place, each crew met its moment, and the sea carried them into their work with steady hands. Through the smoke and sunlight, sails billowed and fell, voices rose in command, and the great wooden hulls groaned with the strain. But always, there remained a kind of grace, a flowing, deliberate unfolding of action shaped by months of preparation and by the quiet unity of those who understood their role within the whole. Above it all, the sky remained vast and pale, watching the shapes of ships move slowly beneath its gaze. As the hours passed and the sun climbed slowly through its arc, the battle moved into its long middle, where each broadside had found its answer, and each ship had settled into the solemn dance of defense and return. The air was thick now with smoke, curling above the waves in languid spirals, softening the outlines of sails and masts, until each vessel seemed like a ghost of itself, drifting between sky and sea. Within this shifting haze, the Franco-Spanish fleet began to yield in a slow, quiet unraveling. Some ships bore their wounds in silence, drifting away from the line with sails in tatters and hulls leaning gently to one side. Others, though still afloat, ceased their fire, their decks quiet, flags slowly lowered as white cloth rose in their place, surrender offered without words, only with the tilt of canvas and the soft slack of halyards in the wind. The French ship Redoutable, so fierce in the early hours, now floated heavily, her masts broken and her guns stilled. She had fought with devotion, her decks filled with the silence of effort and loss, but now her crew stood still, hands resting on railing and ropes, eyes watching the sea rather than the enemy. There was no disgrace in their stillness, only weariness and the quiet dignity of having stood their ground until the moment passed. The Spanish San Juan Nepomuceno, its hull darkened and sails torn, now hung in the water like a spent breath. Her captain, Don Cosme Churuca, had guided her with steadfast courage, but the sea had taken its toll. As British boarding parties approached, they found no resistance, only a crew that had given everything, and who now stood shoulder to shoulder in acceptance of the sea's decision. Aboard HMS Victory, Nelson's strategy continued to unfold with patient effectiveness. One by one, enemy ships became isolated, their ability to support each other gently slipping away. Some drifted into one another, caught in slow-motion entanglements of rigging and spars. Others spun softly in the wind, their rudders unresponsive, their crews looking skyward at flapping, empty sails. The movement of each ship, even in defeat, had a kind of grace, as if the sea itself were guiding them to stillness, one by one. The guns grew quieter. The sounds of hammering and shouted commands faded, and in their place came the creak of hulls, the soft flutter of torn flags, and the occasional splash of water against the side of a listing deck. Some sailors helped each other across ruined planks. Others sat with their backs against warm wood, eyes closed for the first time in hours. Smoke still curled above them, but it no longer masked the sun. Light returned in shafts through the mist, painting every surrendered ship in gold and silver. There were no great cries of victory. The British, too, were quiet now. Their decks bore signs of strain, of courage spent and energy depleted. But they moved with the calm of completion, guiding damaged vessels away from the battle, lowering longboats, and tending to friend and foe alike with measured hands. The sea, which had borne them all to this place, remained unchanged, vast, slow, and wide. It held the fallen masts and drifting sails with the same patience it had offered in the stillness before dawn. And as the battle settled into silence, the ocean once more became a place of reflection. The Franco-Spanish fleet, once proud and poised, now lay scattered across the surface of the Atlantic. It yielded, sail by sail, ship by ship, to the quiet turn of the tide. Beneath the upper deck of HMS Victory, where filtered light slipped through gaps in the beams and the muffled sounds of the sea echoed gently along the timbers, Admiral Nelson lay resting. The battle still murmured distantly above him, its roars and rhythms softened now, as if the very ship had wrapped itself around him in protection. He was surrounded by hushed voices and the quiet care of those who had served him for years. The injury had come swiftly, unexpected, though he had long accepted that the sea might one day claim him. A musket ball, descending through a small opening from the rigging of the Redoubtable, had struck him just after the battle began. There had been no dramatic collapse, no cry, only a slow sinking to the deck, and then the gentle lift of strong arms carrying him below. Now, in the ship's great cabin turned sick room, Nelson lay wrapped in a cloak, his frame settled carefully on a folded coat. A lantern swayed gently above him, casting a soft glow on the wood around. Outside, the ship creaked gently with the movement of the waves. Time slowed. The voices of the surgeon and attending officers drifted like smoke, low and respectful. Nelson's breathing was calm, though shallow. He asked simple questions at first, about the state of the fleet, the progress of the lines. Each report brought a faint smile to his lips. He knew, even before the battle's end, that the course had been set, and that it was holding. His plan was being followed. His fleet was safe. The enemy was scattering. There were moments of stillness between words. In those moments, his gaze lingered on the lantern light above, on the gently swaying shadows, and perhaps, too, on memories that moved silently across his mind. Home, friends, the coastlines of his youth, the many decks and waves that had carried him here. As the hours passed, he grew quieter still. The ship around him breathed slowly, the sounds of ropes, wood, and sea wrapping him like a cradle. The steward sat nearby, watching over him, and occasionally a hand reached out to adjust a blanket, to offer water, to ensure he was not alone. His last words were spoken softly, almost like a lullaby. Now I am satisfied. Thank God I have done my duty. There was no need for more. The words held everything: gratitude, completion, and peace. Outside, HMS Victory still moved through the sea, her sails trimmed, her crew steady. The battle had nearly ended. The wind had gentled, and the fleet, though marked by the cost of the day, remained whole beneath the pale light of the late afternoon. Nelson's body would later be taken home, his name honored in the stone and story. But in that moment, below deck, in the quiet warmth of the ship that had carried him through so much, he was simply a man held by the rhythm of the sea, a final breath joining the vast stillness that rises and falls with the tides. In the days that followed the battle, the winds over the Atlantic turned cool and steady. The smoke that had hovered gently above the sea slowly lifted, leaving behind clear skies and a hush that settled over the water like a quilt. The ships that remained afloat moved softly through the waves, some in tow, others under damaged sail, carrying the marks of conflict with quiet dignity. The Franco-Spanish survivors made their slow return to Cádiz. Along the coast, the townspeople watched the horizon, where broken masts and trailing rigging now moved where proud flags had once flown. The port, so recently filled with the hush of waiting ships, now echoed with the return of quiet sorrow. Families stood at the water's edge, eyes searching each vessel, hoping for a glimpse of someone, anyone, still standing at the rail. Spanish officials moved through the stone corridors of the naval yard in solemn silence. Priests made their way to ships moored at the docks, offering blessings, prayers, and comfort. There was only the soft rhythms of loss, of ritual, of the slow return to peace after the sea had taken its toll. In London, the news arrived over several days, first in fragments carried by small cutters, then in fuller accounts delivered by dispatch boats. At first, there was only the shape of victory, that the Royal Navy had won, that the Franco-Spanish fleet had been scattered, that the nation remained safe from invasion. But alongside the news of triumph came the soft current of grief. Horatio Nelson was gone. The city moved in stillness for a moment, its ever-turning pace slowing in gentle tribute. Across parlors and drawing rooms, people read aloud from newspapers held in trembling hands. In quiet homes and smoky taverns alike, his name was spoken with reverence. As a man who had carried the weight of a nation across endless waters, and who had done so with humility and calm resolve. In Portsmouth, bells tolled softly over the harbor. Black ribbons were tied to lantern posts. Sailmakers and carpenters laid down their tools. And in the great shipyards, men gathered in silence beside the vessels they had built and served upon, their heads bowed not only for Nelson, but for all those who would never return from Trafalgar's tide. Yet there was peace in the air too, a kind of still reassurance that, for a time, the horizon was quiet, that the storm had passed, that the sea, while still vast and unknowable, had yielded to careful hands and steadfast hearts. Letters from sailors began to arrive. Some carried weeks later, some opened with tears. They spoke not of fire and fury, but of the calm between moments, of old friendships rekindled in the face of uncertainty, of shared loaves and quiet prayers, of the way light looked across the water at dawn. And in these reflections, both in Cádiz and in London, in grief and in gratitude, the world began to settle again. The war was not over, but the chapter had closed. The sea had given its verdict, and the wind, ever impartial, carried the echoes of those days out into the open water. In the long years that followed, the name Trafalgar became more than a battle. It became a whisper carried on sea winds, a soft murmur in history books, a tide that turned with quiet consequence. The events of that October morning lingered. Like a bell that continues to resonate long after it is struck, the ripples from Trafalgar reached across the century, shaping the course of empires, ships, and thought itself. Britain emerged from the battle with its naval confidence affirmed. The Royal Navy, already held in high regard, became a symbol of guardianship, of calm, constant presence. For over 100 years after Trafalgar, no enemy fleet would seriously threaten the British Isles. The sea had become a moat once more, broad and watchful, with ships quietly patrolling its surface, their sails now replaced in time with steam and steel. Yet the victory at Trafalgar was not a beginning, it was a preservation, a holding of balance, a quiet confirmation that the world, for now, would turn toward different paths. Napoleon's ambitions to invade Britain quietly receded into the distance, and while wars continued across Europe, the Channel remained undisturbed. The wooden walls had held. The winds had answered. Nelson's memory, too, took on a life of its own, softly revered across generations. Monuments would be raised, streets renamed, poems written. Yet the truest tribute was found not in marble or in ink, but in the way young officers studied his letters, in how naval strategy shifted toward agility and trust, and in how sailors told stories of his calm presence during the most uncertain moments. In Spain and France, the aftermath brought reflection rather than bitterness. The losses were acknowledged with solemn respect. Naval leadership shifted. Lessons were learned. The sea had spoken in a language older than nations, and those who sailed it listened more closely in the years to come. Across Europe, the idea of the great naval clash, the grand fleet-to-fleet engagement, began to fade. Future battles would be shaped by new technologies, new tactics, new political winds. But Trafalgar remained, gently, as a marker. A point on the map where the 19th century truly turned its gaze toward the sea and toward the long, unfolding peace that would follow. In museums, fragments of the ships were preserved. A section of mast from HMS Victory, a piece of carved figurehead, an officer's telescope. Each one, touched by salt and time, seemed to hum with quiet memory. Visitors stood before them with stillness, feeling perhaps the faint breath of wind that once filled their sails. And somewhere far out on the Atlantic, where no ships pass anymore, the waters remain unchanged. They continue to rise and fall in slow rhythm, lapping gently over the space where once sails filled and cannon smoke curled upward. The ocean forgets quickly, but it also holds memory and motion. And there, in that quiet reach of sea, the legacy of Trafalgar drifts on, soft, steady, and timeless. The sea is quiet again. The sails are furled, the cannon stilled, and the wooden decks that once echoed with footsteps now rest in silence. Across the wide Atlantic, the winds have softened into a low murmur, brushing gently over the surface of the water like a whisper from the past. The great ships of Trafalgar, once towering and full of purpose, have drifted slowly from view, their timbers fading into the calm that follows all storms. Tonight, we've journeyed through that quiet stillness, through the breath held before the battle, the measured movement of ships upon the tide, and the soft retreat of sails disappearing beyond the horizon. We walked the decks of Victory and Bucentaur, watched flags rise and fall in the morning light, and followed the final thoughts of those who guided their fleets with silent courage. We listened to the deep calm that surrounded it all, the rhythms of the sea, the rustle of canvas, the stillness of waiting. Now, the stars shine gently overhead, just as they did then, and the sea rocks on as it always has. The story has drawn to a close, but its echo remains, drifting like salt in the air, like the creak of old rope on an empty mast. It is a quiet memory, a soft turning of time. The world beyond your room has quieted. The sails of the mind have been lowered for the night. And now, as you lie in your own calm harbor, you can let go of the day's weight. There are no waves to navigate now. Only breath, slow and easy, like the tide slipping back into the shore. The stories of the past are always there, gentle and waiting, just beyond the horizon of sleep. Let them carry you onward, into rest, into dreams, into the deep, endless calm that follows a journey well taken. Thank you for joining me on tonight's journey. I hope it brought you a little peace, a little wonder, and a little closer to rest. Until next time, sweet dreams.